The Iran-Iraq War was a devastating clash between two totalitarian regimes, set on destroying one another, yet in the end concluded in a simple stalemate after 1 million lay dead from conflict and genocide. In my first part, I discussed the events leading up to the war and how these two countries came into conflict. If you want to see my scenario if Iran won the war, click here. In this part, I'm going to explore what if Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, had successfully defeated Iran in war. What would be the consequences of such a victory? As I explained in part 1, what Saddam aimed to achieve in the war was to 1. Control the Shatt al-Arab waterway, 2. Seize Iran oil resources, and 3. Capture territory Saddam felt was rightfully Iraqi. These 3 objectives are fundamental to understanding what would occur if Saddam had won. However, in our timeline, there were reasons Iraq was unable to keep these objectives. 1 was the size of the Iraq army compared to Iran. 2 was Saddam's constant interference in military affairs. Saddam was never a military leader and barely knew anything about warfare. But that didn't stop him from deciding what the Iraqi military would do. Speaking up against his ignorant plans would result in execution in Saddam's Iraq. So even if the country had actual potential for victory, Saddam ruined it. In any realistic scenario, Iraq could not have won the Iran-Iraq War. The ambitious war was the product of Saddam's vast ignorance and violent personality, even if the odds were terribly not in his favor. In this alternate timeline, say somehow Iraq is able to win even by the slimmest of margins, and Saddam doesn't interfere in military affairs. Iraq wins the war by taking the land and forcing Iran to accept a peace agreement on their terms. Iran would not sit by and allow Iraqis to keep their land. In this alternate timeline, the only way for Iraq to win is to heavily defend the areas they took and make it so costly, Iran is forced to the negotiating table. But for this scenario, let's simply say Iraq does keep the land and forces Iran into a ceasefire. What could happen next? There could be multiple different scenarios. 1. Saddam's goal for Iraq was to become the dominant military and political power in the Middle East. As I said in the last video, the US did not want to see Iran become a major power in the region and spread its revolution. Well, in this alternate timeline, the same would go for Iraq. During the Iran-Iraq War, the West didn't want to see either side win a considerable victory. By either Iran or Iraq winning, it could jeopardize the balance of oil trade from the Persian Gulf. The only reason the United States supported Saddam was not because they loved him, but because the West didn't want to see their oil supply put in jeopardy with an Iranian victory. In this alternate timeline, the West doesn't want Saddam to have so much power in the region, and risks helping out Iran, either by secretly funding rebels in occupied territory or full-out bombing Iraq military positions in Iran. In the scenario, the aim would be to make Iraq relinquish the territory it took from the country. 2. Any military offensive against Iraq would be helping Iran, and due to the recent Iranian hostage crisis, in this alternate timeline, leaders would not be willing to send in the military to aid a Shia theocracy. So in this alternate timeline, the West doesn't counter Saddam's invasion of Iran like it did in Kuwait. Instead, the West aims to appease Saddam and create a new relationship based on oil. Like I said in the last video, we already do that in our timeline, so the scenario could be possible. 3. The West allows Saddam to keep the territory and Iran, and continues a relationship based on oil and deterring Iran. However, Saddam puts his plans to rid Khuzestan of Persian influence into motion. Saddam was a member of the Ba'athist Party, and the Ba'athists took direct inspiration from the Nazis and fascist movements of the 30s. Saddam saw Arabs as superior to the Kurds and Persians, and in our timeline, actively chemical bombed and wiped out Kurdish villages not only to suppress rebellion, but to ethnically cleanse northern Iraq, similar to Hitler against Slavs and Jews. One of the aims of the war was to rid Arab Khuzestan of their Iranian leaders and influence. If Saddam took the region, it's likely he would have mass murdered any non-Arabs. By doing so, this could lead to 2 things in this alternate timeline. Either the international community condemns and takes military and political action against Saddam, or ignores his genocidal actions like they did in our timeline when he bombed the Kurds. Now in this alternate timeline, Saddam would not have invaded Kuwait. Why? In our timeline, after the Iran-Iraq War ended in the late 80s, Saddam's Iraq was in extreme debt after being lent money and weapons from the Gulf nations, the West, and the United States. So in order to help the failing economy and bring Iraq out of debt, Iraq invaded Kuwait, who they also owed money to, in order to control its vast oil supplies. After the dramatic failure against the Americans, Saddam's entire image was at risk, sparking rebellions among the Shia majority and almost bringing his regime to the ground. However, Saddam held on to power by being even more brutal, and although still in power, Iraq was a weak, broken shadow of its former self, Saddam staying in power until being invaded by the US in 2003. In this alternate timeline, without an 8-year-long conflict, vast amount of debt, and new access to Iranian oil fields, Saddam doesn't invade Kuwait. Invading oil-rich Kuwait made Saddam, who before then was an ally to the Americans, an instant enemy, changing the relationship between the two. Without the Persian Gulf War, Saddam does not lose the United States, and so his image is not tarnished. His control over his country is not put into jeopardy. Without the war, say if the US didn't come into conflict over Khuzestan, Iraq's relationship with the US is shaky, but not entirely hostile. Saddam could have remained in power well into the 21st century, boasting an arsenal of chemical weapons that the West tolerates because there was never a military conflict between the two. If Iraq won the war, it could have changed the modern history of the Middle East, in ways pretty obvious that I don't need to mention. Of course, this is just theorizing, and not supposed to be an 100% prediction. Since I listed some possibilities from an Iraqi victory, what do you think would have happened if Iraq won the Iran-Iraq War? Say in the comments, like on Facebook, and subscribe if you have not done so. This is Cody from the Alternate History Hub.